Good morning.
Good morning.
And good morning. I love this tradition. I love the fact that in a world of turmoil and strife and craziness, we have three people from three different and very ancient religious traditions who are willing to sit in the same space and converse and sort of probe and do that with honesty and civility. And if there were more of it, we'd probably be better off. Can't hear me, okay. I'd love it if you started, if each of you started to sort of give me, I mean, we're in Los Angeles, we get the Hollywood pitch all the time, we know what it is. So your 30-second elevator description of what your respective religious tradition is, sort of what the hallmark of it is. Why don't we start here with Rabbi Shapiro.
I don't think there's ever been a rabbi who answered a question in 30 seconds. Well, Karen, you're not the first person to ever ask that question. The famous Rabbi Hillel in the 3rd century was asked, sort of standing on one foot, what is Judaism all about? And he said, what is hateful to you, do not do to another. Sort of the Jewish version of the Golden Rule. And that most certainly is at the core of our tradition, and I'm going to add one layer to that, which is a traditional Jew is supposed to aspire to say 100 blessings a day. If you eat a fresh apple, there's a blessing for that. You wake up in the morning, there's a blessing for that. You survive a car accident, there's a blessing for that. You see a friend you haven't seen in a long time, there's a blessing for that. And all of this, I believe, is because Judaism is a tradition about taking the mundane and making it holy, about transforming the ordinary into the extraordinary. And so we, I think, at our core, are about taking these everyday moments in life and making them holy, making them extraordinary.
Imam Turk.
Islam is about violence and... No, I'm just kidding.
I was wondering if there was going to be any element of humor in this conversation.
News at 11. News at 11.
So we're kind of the new kids on the block in terms of the Abrahamic faiths, and we have the vantage point of looking back and identifying with Abraham as we began with our young people here today, as really the core of our faith is the teaching of Abraham, the belief in one God, not worshiping false deities. And in our version of the Golden Rule, Muhammad, who came about 6 centuries after Jesus in the Arabian Peninsula, he taught his followers, he said, none of you are truly faithful unless you love for others what you love for yourself. And I think worship of God and good treatment of others is the essence of our faith.
My turn?
Your turn.
Okay.
And you can sing it if you want.
I'm not going to sing. No. I would answer the question in 2 different ways. If you answer it in terms of what Jesus said, I think you could say that the Christian faith is very much about bringing healing to those who have been wounded by life, to bringing goodness to those for whom life has been unfair and difficult. It's about bringing hope and love to others. And so very much the thread around justice that goes through the Jewish faith, the Islamic faith, it is also in the Christian faith. And I think that was very much the message of Jesus. There was yet another message, though, that I think in a way encapsulated the essence of Jesus and now is part of the Christian faith, and it is that the prime revelation of Jesus is that God is a God of love. And so to love others is to know God. And if we don't love others, we don't know God. And that at the essence of life, at the essence of the universe itself, there is love. And that's, I think, really goes to the heart of the Christian faith.
So these are the things, in many ways, that you all have in common. The monotheism, the idea that there's good that needs to be done in the world, that you're personally responsible for contributing to the greater wellspring of good that exists in the world. But you also have traditions where you diverge from one another. Can you all talk about that for a minute? And anybody who wants to start can. 3 men of faith, 30 seconds of silence. You're never going to see that again.
Well, I'll start. I think that one of the things that we see, it's not so much sometimes as much differences as maybe the accent mark is placed at a different place in the faith. For example, some people try to create this dichotomy between an Old Testament God and a New Testament God. To me, that is a false dichotomy, and it's really not helpful. There is indeed a God of justice, and the God of justice can be found in Hebrew Scripture, and the God of justice can be found in the Quran, and the God of justice can be found in Christian Scripture. On the other hand, I think God's steadfast love can be found in all of our traditions as well. And so it's not so much that there are divergences, but that sometimes the accent mark is placed in a different way. Of course, as a Christian, we have special emphasis around the person of Jesus. And we think not only was Jesus a great teacher, but even more than that, that somehow in the life of Jesus, the presence of God had come to be incarnated into his life. Therefore, to know Jesus is to know the divine presence. Now, even Christians interpret that in a lot of different ways, but that's at least one thing I would say about it.
I would say, in the same vein, that we each have a relationship with the same God, but those relationships, just like a parent's relationship with their 3 children or 4 children or what have you, are each different, right? And so I think we each articulate our relationship with our God through our revelation, through our text, through our respective traditions. But I think that, right, I don't have children yet, but those who have children, I'm sure, would agree with me that, right, you love each of your children differently, not more, not less. You have different kinds of relationships with each of your children, but they're not valued in different ways, and they're all, right, parts of the same family. And so I think that we articulate our relationship with God differently and through different texts and through different traditions, but it's the same basic relationship.
And I would say that while acknowledging that we have, in essence, at the heart of our respective faiths, the notion that God is central and that ultimately we want to be good people, to grow in our character and to serve our fellow human being to whatever capacity we have, I would say that we, at the same time, have each exclusive truth claims, which, as I was teaching a class this morning, and some of my students were here in the audience congregation today, and we were talking about how having an exclusive truth claim doesn't mean that we have a notion of exclusive salvation. And in fact, not only do we believe in Jesus and the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of Moses, as all coming from the same source, God Almighty, but we might have a different interpretation of them. For example, in our believing in Jesus, even the miraculous birth, something that most Christians might not realize, we are followers of Jesus, but we view Jesus differently. It's a matter of accent or emphasis. We view Jesus as being divinely inspired by the Holy Spirit, and as a role model and example for all of humanity, and as a human being nonetheless, and we relate to him more fully in his capacity as a human being trying to fulfill the charge that God gave him in life. And at the same time, anyone, as our scripture teaches, who believes in God and the day of judgment and does good deeds can attain salvation.
The thing that I find is that sometimes it's not... People of different faiths sometimes share more in common because they have a particular outlook, not just on their faith, but an outlook on how they understand life today. And sometimes there are more differences between people within the same faith because they have a radically different view of life. And so it's really interesting because on the one hand, I have my 2 colleagues here. We represent 3 different traditions. But I have more in common with them than I have a lot of other Christian ministers who come at things in a very narrow, rigid, literalistic way. I don't know what to do with them anymore. These guys, I know what to do with. We can actually have a conversation. But there's some people, maybe of the same faith, you can't even have a conversation with them. And so to me, that's one of the interesting dynamics in terms of where we are at the 21st century.
And maybe just to highlight that point, I mean, earlier this year in February, there was a big controversy that arose in the Orange County Registrar when something that Beau said earlier, we all worship the same God. There was an attribution of this statement to an evangelical church that our community was in conversation with, an unnamed church, and the pushback that they got. Their pastor is Satan incarnate, and from people who are fellow evangelicals, from the notion that we worship the same God. I mean, it was that kind of reaction. It didn't have a blip in our community, at least not in the West, although you would find some people in some parts of the Muslim world who would have equally, sort of visceral reaction to that. And I would argue it's not so much because of theology or the theological basis, but there's so much more to life that influences people's sentiments and temperaments that has to do with culture and tradition and economics and geopolitics that's at play. So.
Yeah.
Religion in the United States has gotten very politicized it always has been to a certain degree, but much more nakedly politicized in the past, I would say, decade. I mean, I've been reporting for, oh, never mind, I'm really old. But anyway, it's been going on for a while, and it seems to me that especially in the last couple of elections, there was a lot of weighing in from religious leaders when normally, for a long time, we'd stayed a little bit separate from that. I'm wondering if you all are seeing this where you are from your respective positions and what you think about it. I was reading something the other day, and this was an evangelical minister who just said, normally I don't endorse. I feel really strongly that at this point we're dangling at the precipice, and our whole morality as Americans is in danger, and so I'm going to tell people how I'm voting, and I kind of would like them to pay attention. I'll deal with the IRS later. And I thought, wow. Yeah. What do you think?
I share your analysis of this trend, and personally, I think I'm troubled by it for a few reasons. I think I'm troubled not necessarily by candidates or parties claiming ownership of God, although I think that is problematic. But I'm more troubled by our colleagues, I think, who do take sides and make their political views public. And I think I'm troubled by that because, in my opinion, there are Christians in all places on the political spectrum. There are Jews at all places on the political spectrum. There are Muslims at all places on the political spectrum. And for those of us who serve diverse communities, my first and foremost responsibility is that the synagogue is a place where they feel at home and they feel comfortable. And if the synagogue becomes a political place, if the synagogue becomes red or blue or Republican or Democrat, then suddenly there's a faction of the congregation who no longer feels at home in that space. And so I think that our job is to make it a place where conversation and discourse can take place, but where everyone feels reflected and represented. And I think when we, as leadership, polarize it, I think that has lasting consequences that are in some ways, much more important than an election or than a ballot initiative.
Yeah, well, there are politics in the church, but nothing about Republican or
no
Democrat.
Politics in the synagogue.
Else, yes, but that's for another sermon. But I hear what you're saying. The only thing that I struggle with sometimes is that I agree with you that it's not the job of the minister to tell people whom they should vote for. So I understand that. But there are issues that take on a moral tone for some of us that are really important. Like the issue of the fact that our country seems to go into war after war after war. And in my mind, it's not just a political issue. It's a moral issue. How women are treated, that's a moral issue. How children are treated, that's a moral issue. So those things, and also, I tend to lean a little One Direction. I know that. But
You're leaning in that direction now,
I'm
physically.
leaning in that direction, yes.
Towards Islam.
I wasn't brilliant, but I could guess.
But even so, I do at least understand why people sometimes on the right think of issues as moral issues. I may see them differently, but I get it. I understand it. I think the questions around the death penalty, questions around abortion, these are not easy issues. But just because they're not easy issues, it doesn't make them non-moral issues. They are important. Yeah, help me.
We're just happy to have a Muslim in office. No. He's not Muslim. All right. So, no.
Never thought I would see it. A Muslim or a Mormon. Here we are.
But seriously, in that vein, we've noticed that in the last several elections that there's, we've been used, our community, our faith has been used as a wedge issue, whether someone is going to be more aggressive against Islam and Muslims and vilify those who follow our faith in broad strokes, because there is this politics of fear that exists in our country. And unfortunately, a lot of the fear is based on taking a real threat that's out there, and then for those who don't have a nuanced understanding of how to perceive that threat and deal with that threat, excite people to vote in a for or against a political party, and that leaves us in a challenging position as a community, but one that I think we're stepping up to respond to, and that is simply being known for who we are in our own voice, because so oftentimes we're not heard from, and when we go and we speak publicly, it's like, well, all we've heard is what the guy in the cave was saying. We've never heard anyone else speaking about your faith, so you must be the only one speaking. But we just don't have the platform. We don't have our own voice yet, and we're trying to ramp up as a community and be more engaged in civic society, etc. And we do get involved in particularly not partisan politics, but on issues. I recently signed on to a faith-based effort to support Proposition 30, for example, with education, because we do see it as a moral issue, the education of our children, et cetera. And so, and public education at that, because we want to make sure that there's a safety net for the most vulnerable in our community. So when my children came home from school one day, they said, "Which direction are you going to vote on these propositions?" And I said, well, I ordered a ballot by mail, and we sat down, we went through it, and it was a teaching moment. So I think as people of faith, as leaders of faith, we should weigh in on moral issues, but I agree at the same time that we shouldn't become partisan in our congregations to the point where people are left feeling unwelcome there. But it is a place for conversations to be had, and I think if we could at least model how to have those important conversations without scaring people and without vilifying other people, and respecting the differences that ultimately people draw at the end, I think that we've done our job.
I agree, and I'll just add that to me, one of the things that faith communities can do, we can really help raise the level of discourse in our society. When you think about it, we're one of the few places left in our society where we actually can sit and talk about issues and do it in a way that's respectful and that's helpful to one another. This last August, I did this sermon series on God and politics, and the point was not to steer somebody one direction or another. It was simply to get us to think and to feel and to talk in a little different way. And to me, all three of our communities can really do that.
Let's talk about young people for a minute, because there was a recent study that's shown up in a number of places that you all have probably seen and read about in the newspaper that basically says that younger Americans are getting less and less attached to a specific church or a specific religion and are more and more interested in spirituality, that they may church surf, they may never go to church, much to their parents' dismay. They may go to several different churches, or they may, start out doing it, leave for several years, several decades, even come back. Part of it may be generational, I don't know. But that you find older Americans as well, who maybe started out as Congregationalists and ended up as Buddhists because they found a different path for themselves. What this study seems to indicate is that church populations, church with a small c, may become smaller as time goes on because people are finding God or Allah in their own way, not necessarily dependent upon the structure of institutional religion. Does that worry you?
I'm worried. Yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubt that there's a changing demographic, and yet, but like with everything, every change is also an opportunity, and I think there is an opportunity, and I see it here in this community, where we seem to be, for whatever reason, I don't know always, but drawing more and more younger adults to our congregation. And I think that they come here not because they're looking for a set of correct beliefs, as much as they're looking for a place where they can belong, a community they can come to know and have others know them, and that, you know, there's a way for them to feel like they're a part of something more than just themselves. And so, you know, I always feel like, you know, religion is deeply personal. And it always has been and it always will be. But just because it's personal doesn't mean that it's individualistic. And so to me, that's part of the value of, you know, a quote-unquote organized religion. It gives people a place to connect. And to me, there's something still really attractive about that. I don't know what you all see in your community.
It's really interesting. I think longer than this has been a demographic issue for religion in general, I think the Jewish community has been focused on issues of assimilation and sort of dwindling populations and affiliation amongst young folks. And I think what I observe and what is challenging to me is sort of the rise of either sort of new age spiritual practice that doesn't fit, you know, nicely into any category, and moreover, secular ethics and morality. Right? I frequently have conversations with people who say, well, you know, I'm a cultural Jew, right? I like bagels and lox, and the pastrami at Langer's is amazing. But, you know, I'm not religious. I'm a good person. You know, I believe in being a good person. I believe in being an ethical, moral human being. But that's not Jewish. That's just being a good American or a good person. And that's fine for now. But, you know, those ethics and morals all come from somewhere. They didn't come out of thin air. They come out of our traditions, if you go back far enough. And I think what worries me is that secular ethics and morality, I don't believe, travel very well. So I don't think that, right, 3 generations from now, 5 generations from now, secular ethics and morality are successfully passed down in the way that ethics and morality packaged in a religious tradition is. And so I think that what we risk with this sort of abstract morality, abstract ethics, is something that continues to become more and more watered down and further from the center as time progresses. And I wonder, you know, what will that look like 100 years from now, 200 years from now?
So I would say that I welcome the challenge in a sense. I'm not concerned or worried, but I say that those statistics tell us that we need to make religion relevant for the next generation. And there are changing mindsets that tend to be more open, more inclusive, and sometimes the perspectives offered at institutions, religious institutions, tend to be antiquated, speaking to an older generation, older population. And I think that as a community, as a religious community, Muslim community, we need to be looking in the other direction at the next generations and making religion relevant and meaningful, and figuring out what is baggage in terms of tradition. And in our case, we're so many different ethnic and racial backgrounds that we immigrated to this country from, that we need to distill out from amongst all of those the essence of the religion and figure out how to make it distinctly at least specifically for our community, American Islam or American, develop an American Muslim identity and community that passes on meaning from one generation to the next, and will allow our next generation to express themselves culturally as Americans, but with the values and teachings of Islam, and to make sure that the institutions provide space for that cultural and religious identity to form. My concern is that some mosques are doing it, like the Islamic Center of Southern California, where I serve as a religious advisor, but also, there are so many other institutions that are ethnocentric, and that they become irrelevant for the next generation. That's much more, inclusive, not just in terms of other faiths, but other ethnic and racial backgrounds as well. And so, I see it as a challenge, but I think it's something that we need to respond to with transformation and vision.
I think we have to, just to add one thing, I think we have to, yes, as Jihad said, reimagine what our communities can look like, and the ways in which we engage people, right? So, saying it needs to be about social media is not a new thing anymore, right? I think we have to look for new access points for people. What worked, 20 years ago to get people in the door isn't going to work for, now, isn't going to work for the younger demographic now. And I think, some of the interesting things that I've encountered recently is, bringing the religious experience to people where they are, right? I have a colleague who has a synagogue in Washington, D.C., who has services at a different subway stop every Friday throughout the month, 1 month a year, right? Telling people, look, don't worry about getting to us. We're going to bring this to you. We're going to bring it to your neighborhood, and create, a small, intimate experience for you that will help you, make your way into the community. But I think we have to keep rethinking how we do things and how we can engage a new generation.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, because part of what I see churches all around the country, in an American context at least, struggle with, is that, basically the 50s and 60s were the heyday of American Protestantism. The peak of attendance in American Protestant tradition was 1974. Since 1974, attendance has been dropping. It was dropping like a rock for a while, but now it's sort of leveled out a little bit, but it's just been declining. The struggle in most every church is that you still have people who were part of that 50s, 60s generation. And so when they have this conversation, the conversation is always, how can we get back to something? Well, we're never going to get back to it. The question is, how do we go forward? And I think what you're speaking about your colleague in Washington and all around the country, how do we move forward in a way that can still be fresh to younger generations? That's the challenge.
And we are out of time. I want to thank Rabbi Shapiro, Imam Turk, Reverend Colglazier. They'll all be outside for a little while after the service, so you can pepper them with your individual questions. Like, I still want to know, where do we go when we die? But that's a whole other conversation. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Claire.
You're very welcome.
You did great. Thank you. Thank you.